Hey guys, welcome to this GigaOm webinar, 5 secrets to on-premise Kubernetes for real-world enterprise IT needs. And this is going to be a learning event, so you're going to learn a lot about what Kubernetes is, how it is manage it correctly, and also some rules of thumb and some best practices in terms of how people are succeeding with Kubernetes. Also, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Stratoscale, for arranging this webinar. You can find more about Stratoscale at stratoscale.com, and let's get right into it. So joining me today is my guest host, webinar partner, John. So John, tell us what you do at what you do over at Stratoscale. Excuse me.
Thanks, David. So I'm responsible for business development. That means that I actually look after our strategic partnerships and alliances, and have a team that works closely with both software vendors as well as hardware vendors. So think of your traditional infrastructure suppliers as well as some kind of higher up the stack application vendors as well. So I've actually been with the company since the very beginning. So I think LinkedIn just reminded me it was my 6-year anniversary or something like that recently. And then prior to that, I was I come from a long line of being in the infrastructure IT space, and obviously a software development background that led me there as well. So it's been pretty exciting over the course of my career, seeing kind of the trajectory and the changes in the industry along the times. And now we're kind of entering, in my opinion, kind of this new era of containers. So pretty exciting. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it absolutely is exciting. We're looking forward to the webinar. One question about your background. So when did you decide to kind of move out of development into what you're doing now? When did you go to the
I joke with people and tell people, I joined the dark side. I mean, my career path started off being an engineer straight out of the university. I was a computer science guy coming out of the University of Texas in Austin. I loved it. I loved building. I was working on big data projects for the federal government, which is pretty fun. Saw a lot of data on what the government has on us. And then eventually I started moving into more of the operations side, but I stayed kind of close to the software, went into product management, running product management. So started getting more of a feel for what customers were doing on a day-to-day basis. And, only in the last, I would say, handfuls of years, I started moving closer and closer into partnerships and into alliances and so forth. But deep down, ignoring the suit and all, I'm still a techie at heart. I like to think, at least, maybe a little bit not as smart these days as I was coming out of the university, but hopefully we'll still be able to have a great conversation today.
Absolutely. I think some of the best partnership guys, biz dev guys, product manager guys are folks who have actually built stuff before. So it's a great way to actually move into that, versus going directly in it. Yeah. So anyway, let's get into the agenda. We're going to get into some important topics today. We're going to talk about why approaches to Kubernetes are changing, and we'll talk about some of the emerging best practices. I'll share some of the stuff I know, and John will share some of the stuff he knows. A little bit of inside baseball as to what you guys need to look out for and what you guys need to adopt. We'll talk about emerging best practices and technology. We'll talk about 5 secrets of Kubernetes, enabling container orchestration that enterprises and cloud providers need for success. And then finally, must-know keys to enabling successful technology. And then we'll have the Q&A option as well. So if you see right there on your dashboard, you see a question, and while we're talking, we can't answer them while we're doing during the core webinar, but at the end of the webinar, we are going to have about 10-15 minutes for Q&A, and I'd like you guys to participate in that, as well as the polling that's coming up. And so please take time to ask a question if you have something you want us to elaborate on. So let's get going. So John, why don't you tell us a bit about bringing Kubernetes on-prem to the public cloud style?
So yeah, I mean, I work for a company called Stratoscale, who's sponsoring this webinar, and we're kind of relevant in this space because we built an enterprise container platform, and in this kind of headline of bringing Kubernetes on-prem, the public cloud style. What that really means is, Kubernetes is becoming quite popular when you think about, the public cloud vendors like Amazon or Google Cloud, even Microsoft with Azure. And each of them have done a pretty amazing job of turning Kubernetes into something that's consumed as a service obviously within their data centers and within the public cloud itself. So when we talk about bringing kind of this style of the public cloud into enterprise IT, we've literally kind of used that as our model and our inspiration, and we've turned Kubernetes into something that enterprise IT through our software can deliver as a service to their customers out of their own data centers, right? So a lot of our focus around our platform, which hopefully we'll talk about at the end of the webinar as well, is that our container platform is really focused around automating all of the, not only the deployment, but all of the ongoing management required to have a successful Kubernetes implementation, both in the data center, and then we have some customers also doing this in edge locations, whether it be a remote office or even into the field in certain use cases in certain verticals.
So what would you consider to be the two major value points of your technology within the space?
I think the two main value that we bring to organizations is we give the internal users, so whether that be developers and application teams, we give them that same experience that they would find in the public cloud, which primarily around the ease of on-demand provisioning, right? So they don't have to worry about setting up tickets and configuring and installing it themselves. So that's kind of all out of the box. We deliver that value to those users. And then secondly, we provide tremendous value to the operations teams. So as Kubernetes, I think we'll talk about this later, but as Kubernetes kind of moving into more mainstream IT practices, there's a lot of things that you have to do to support those platforms, right? Support those clusters and those environments. So a lot of the value we bring is around the kind of the operational management and being able to automate a lot of that functionality. That's really the value, kind of the two sets of values we bring at Stratoscale.
Looking forward to get into it. So let's get to our first poll question, and we'll do some discussion here. So where do you deploy your Kubernetes cluster? On-prem, public cloud, single public, and I had to define this, single public cloud vendor, multi-cloud, several public cloud vendors, and hybrid cloud, on-prem and public cloud, or other. So let's go ahead and have you guys weigh in on this. And then, so John, what do you think before we see the results? What's going to be the top one? And I guess there should be betting now, right?
Oh man, if I had to guess, I would guess most people are still using the public cloud, but probably I would say probably a split between public cloud and hybrid cloud. That'd be my guess.
No, I agree with you. Actually, I'm going to go a different way just to be argumentative. So I think it's public cloud first. We agree on that, but I think it's going to be multi-cloud second.
Okay.
It'll be interesting how many people are doing things on-prem, because we are seeing some on-prem based Kubernetes, but they typically have the plan of actually doing it on-prem and then moving out to the moving it out to a public cloud. So do you see that in your customer space?
We do see that. I mean, I think the nice thing is, as we know, if people have been following in space, I mean, one of the big promises of Kubernetes is to give you that portability. So I think that's it's an interesting way to think about how they're going to solve portability, either on-prem or in the public cloud.
Okay, so we're going to wait a minute and see the results, and we'll post the results when you get a chance. And here we go. So where do you deploy your Kubernetes cluster, public cloud? Hey, we were wrong. Reverse. Well, you were right. That have been reverse, but I was wrong on multi-cloud, 0%. Man, I knocked it out. But what's most interesting is kind of the on-prem thing that's in there, and the interest in doing things on-prem. So are we finding when people are doing things on-prem, they plan on moving it to the public cloud as soon as they're done, or is this something where they're going to have it into production, John?
I think it actually boils down to the application itself. I often advise our customers, the public cloud is always going to have one strategic advantage over anything you do on-prem, and that's the kind of the on-demand elasticity of infrastructure or capacity, right? And you can't do that in an on-prem environment. In your own data centers, you don't have infinite, or perceived infinite kind of capacity, right? So if you have applications that need that level of burstiness or kind of that peaky behavior, then I think that's a good candidate for an application that should run in the public cloud. In my experience working with customers, most applications don't fall in that category. There are obviously a subset of applications that do. Even within a large online company, there are applications that are relatively steady state in terms of their utilization. But what you do need and what you do get as a benefit from using things like Kubernetes is you get the ability to innovate and kind of the speed from a release cycle management perspective, right? So that's still a benefit that you get. And I think containers, on-prem or in public cloud offer that. So it really depends. I don't think I don't see that universally as a single truth that people are starting to develop on-prem and moving to the public cloud, or vice versa, right? I think it kind of is a case-by-case basis by application.
All right, well, let's put the poll away and move on, and we'll talk about some of the things going forward. So why are approaches to Kubernetes success, or excuse me, why approaches to Kubernetes success are changing? A bit awkward there. And so, John, what's your take on this as we kind of get into it? So in other words, I'm finding that where best practices are kind of emerging and people are altering and being kind of in a very agile DevOpsy way, and the fact that we're changing the enabling technology or approaches, how we do some skill sets, things like that. So what do you see changing?
Well, I think the macro trend in the industry you see is that there is a realization that software is driving the world, and most companies it's becoming more and more a core part of who they are, right? So as a result of that, you hear about very macro level initiatives like digital transformations or cloud transformation. The end goal that I think is being trying to be achieved is just speed and agility. And I think there's definitely a natural association with that, with containerization, with how new applications and modern applications are being architected. And Kubernetes is, I think a big part of that, from an enablement perspective. So I think that from a very high level, Kubernetes is viewed as a new approach, a new platform for application development, but also for application delivery, right? And that's a big thing. So I think if you add all of those things up, that's really the heart, kind of the genesis of why things are starting to accelerate for the Kubernetes community as a whole.
Yeah, I think that what I'm seeing when I'm talking to clients and people who are out in the industry is that ultimately it becomes the fact that they're not necessarily going for portability as an objective, but they're going for the fact that they're looking for an ease of engineering and the ability to kind of abstract a lot of the complexity away from some of the applications they're deploying. Right. So ultimately, this is about, and by the way, we've been in the container world before. We had J2EE, we had, I'm old, so I remember distributed objects, Corba-based systems, DCOM and COM, all these sorts of things, which kind of evolved to, where we are with containers. But the containers in themselves really didn't solve a problem. And one of the things I think that was missing from the old distributed object days and in the early containerization days was really kind of an advanced engine to allow these things to scale and allow these things to sit in cluster management and scheduling, and all these things were missing in space. So adding these features that Kubernetes has, was it just kind of the right time, right place, right technology that kind of caused the revolution right now?
I think so. I mean, I think also if you've been following the container industry, there was also competing kind of orchestration layers, right? And I think the community and the industry has spoken, and I think what's going to accelerate this shift to containers is going to be the fact that Kubernetes has become, I think, the de facto standard. It's safe to say now that that is the engine that will power containers and power this new kind of these workflows and these architectures of modern applications.
Yeah, I remember I was at a container conference, I think oh boy, how long was it? 4 years ago. And I kind of announced that when Kubernetes showed up, that it was going to be such a big deal. And I think people didn't really see it, but it's one of these things you have to try and understand the value before you can figure out how it works into an architecture. And the whole thing, when you look at Kubernetes in terms of as a solution pattern, we've had the problem pattern for years, and we really haven't anything that's able to do so in kind of an open source way. Yeah. So last thoughts on the evolution of IT?
No, I think people that at one point thought containers was kind of a fad, I think it's clearly been shown that it's not. And I think now it's going to be a question of how quickly will it grow, right? And we obviously know that new applications being developed will head in this direction. So I know there's a lot of vendors in the industry trying to figure out how do you also bring over more legacy applications into a container world, just to kind of benefit from the same kinds of simplicity that you gain. So it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see.
So it's developer productivity and it's operational productivity, but one of the things that I see containers solving that seems to be an emerging problem is the growth of complexity. And so we're getting into this cloud complexity, which is kind of the new buzzword now. And that's kind of caused the fact that we're adding cloud-based systems, either net new based systems. We've been turbocharging our ability to push code out with DevOps and containerization, and certainly some awesome containerization tools that allow us to, in essence, leverage Kubernetes and get it to the scaling stuff and manage and schedule and do all the things you need to do to get at the business of actually running an application. But this is leading to complexity because we're not dealing with the existing on-premise apps. We've done a lot of lift and shift. We're building some net new stuff. So, we're ending up with, 1,000 endpoints in a typical small enterprise, and an endpoint would be an application or a database or, a platform that we're even an IoT-based system. But now we're getting to 2,000. And by the way, we're not increasing budgets. And so we're still dealing with the same amount of money, the same amount of people. And we're kind of entering into this crisis of complexity. And so what we need to do is, in essence, think ahead of the complexity showing up on your doorstep and leveraging new enabling technologies such as Kubernetes. So what's your idea of this, John?
I mean, I think this is a huge challenge that I think we're still in the middle of from an industry perspective, right? Because if you think about, I remember going back, I spent some time in the networking space as well, and I remember this kind of not the exact, but I feel like a very analogous shift where things started to become more and more virtualized, and you started having this problem where roles and responsibilities became very mushy, right? And people became not very clear as to who owned what and what, where the responsibilities were. So I actually think the complexity spans kind of two vectors, right? Not only from a technology point of view, but from an organization point of view. You're bringing together, historically, you're bringing together now closer, line of business application teams with infrastructure and operations teams, and they're getting kind of more and more embedded with each other, especially with something like Kubernetes in the heart of it. And so now you have to figure out also from a process and organization perspective, where did those roles and responsibilities get divided, right? Like, so who's responsible ultimately for, like on your slide here, like who's responsible for security and for management and ops, and how does that get rolled out, and how does that get done transparently in a way where you're not impacting the productivity of the developers, right? So I saw the same things, like I said, in the networking world, when you started taking things like a physical network box, like a switch that was managed by a network team, very, very black and white, like they owned that, and you started to virtualize that and put in software-defined networking capabilities, and suddenly the responsibilities kind of morphed a little bit, right? So I see this as actually an order of magnitude more complex, because you're now spanning the entire gamut all the way up to the application team, not just within infrastructure or within IT today. So that's my view.
So what do you think would be the solution to this? And obviously throwing technology is one thing, but should it be a mix of technology and approaches, and probably some different ways of thinking about how we're dealing with systems out there?
Yeah, I don't have the perfect answer for this. I think it's going to be something we're going to evolve as an industry. But obviously technology is a core part of it. You need to have technology that allows, in my opinion, a clear kind of separation of roles and responsibilities, because it's easy to introduce technology. It's harder to change an entire enterprise organizational structure. So if you can figure out a technology and implementation and approach that lends itself to kind of allowing developers to have a productive work environment, being able to do what they do best, that would be ideal, and then let infrastructure do what they do best, which is around compliance and security and governance and cost control and so forth. Then you kind of get the best of both worlds. So I don't have a perfect answer for that and how to actually implement that. I think obviously from Stratoscale's point of view, we have some thoughts and opinions on how we can enable that through technology, but I think it is something that's a little bit broader and more encompassing as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. So emerging best practices in technology, and I'll give you my take on this, and I think John will opine on this as well. So ultimately, I think we need to think drastically differently about how we implement technology such as Kubernetes. Kubernetes is a very powerful technology. It's probably one of the better technologies that I've seen in 20 years in terms of its ability to solve issues and implement things, and an ability to run on multiple platforms, ability to be managed by multiple people, and also the ability to find general skill sets and tool-based ecosystems out there to be able to support it. I think one of the things that's missing is a best practice, and I kind of view this as a best practice, be it that I see people who do this are able to succeed, and people who do not do this will fail with their Kubernetes project, is the ability to do architecture and planning. And that sounds very simple, and there's old man Linthicum again, talking about his planning and architecture. But, I think that it's something that can be done on the back of the napkin, but we need to put some planning, some capacity issues, some monitoring management, deal with security and all these things before we start implementing the technology. There seems to be this notion that we're going to go out there and fail, 5 times before we succeed once. And I think we can certainly fail, but I think we need to lower the number of failures and kind of ensure success, based on not making stupid mistakes. So what's your take on this, John?
Well, I think it's kind of like most new technologies, especially if they're very developer oriented. The leaders of the forefront of this technology is typically not coming from enterprise IT, right? It's coming from lines, application teams and developers and so forth. So they see the benefit of the platforms, something like Kubernetes, in terms of how it accelerates their ability to develop applications and architect. They're not, and hope I don't offend anybody, but they're also not the ones that typically are thinking about some of the infrastructure and operational challenges, right? Because coming as my background as a developer, I never thought about those things. It wasn't until I got into the industry formally. As a developer, you're thinking about application architecture and functionality and obviously deadlines, right? You're not thinking about what comes after that, right? How do you support and maintain and operate, all of those aspects that come after. So. I think that, like we said earlier, I think this is a time where maybe enterprise IT is looking to find a way to catch up and be able to provide a valuable solution to kind of hold up their end of the responsibility. So
John, I'm going to kick this one back to you. So what do you think changed with the introduction of Kubernetes in terms of how we do computing, leveraging that technology versus more traditional approaches, even non-traditional approaches that have been in the cloud, but have been since had Kubernetes replace them?
Well, I think containerization. If you've been following the history of it, it's not anything new. And there's obviously the biggest shift is at that container level, is the fact that you're no longer requiring an application to be packaged and aware of everything else around it, like the operating system itself, right? And so this is it's a nice evolution in terms of kind of a higher level of abstraction that allows developers just to focus on their code. And I think that's the biggest fundamental shift. Whereas in the past, when we talk about roles and responsibilities again, most of infrastructure teams in IT, historically, their responsibility ended at handing over a server or some storage and some networking, right? Whether that be physical or virtualized and so forth. And I think the biggest difference now is that developers, they don't want to deal with those levels of nuances and those levels of details, because it's not really a necessary and critical component to the application itself, which is again their responsibility. So I think that's become the biggest challenge. So Kubernetes, I think the biggest difference from an operations point of view is providing a platform in which it allows developers to build architectures and depend on an engine, like you said earlier, that can manage their application without having to worry about the underlying infrastructure. That's a nice kind of separation of responsibilities. So I think that's the biggest change, is that you're kind of decoupling again the roles and responsibilities and segmenting those in a nice, clean way.
So go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, this is actually, I like the slide too, because sorry for jumping in, but this is, in my opinion, when you talk about integration with, I see like a big AWS Lambda logo on here, but this is another example where you're providing yet another level of abstraction that benefits developers entirely as well. So I don't know if we're going to talk about that, but that's another example, kind of the evolution of further separating roles and responsibilities through technology and platforms.
Why don't you expand on that?
Well, so I don't know if people are familiar, if the audience is familiar with what Lambda is, but Lambda is part of a new kind of emerging category of something that people call serverless, or sometimes you might refer to it as functions as a service. And I've used this personally on my, I know this is this is how you know I'm still a techie, because on the weekends I will still do some development. But I've actually used Amazon Lambda before just to experience what it was. And what it effectively is if you think about going, the evolution from physical server to virtual machine to now container, you could think about a function as yet another abstraction layer on top of that. And a function now, instead of building in a container, you literally can take code, whether it be a piece of Java code or a Python code or many different languages, and you can kind of upload this to a platform like Lambda, and Lambda will take care of executing all of that for you. You don't have to worry about bringing in the right Java engine or the right Java runtime or the right Python version. It takes care of all of those logistics for you, which makes, again, of course, from a developer point of view, it makes their life a hell of a lot easier, very productive. Now, the tie back to Kubernetes here is that oftentimes there's kind of two levels of integration. Number one, the function as a service, or Lambda, is oftentimes running on top of a container framework like Kubernetes, right? And there's also natural integrations specifically with services like Lambda into not only Kubernetes but also other cloud services offered within Amazon. Now, Amazon, obviously they've built kind of a relatively closed ecosystem, right? So Lambda integrates very nicely with Kubernetes, but it integrates even more nicely with other Amazon services, naturally. And there are other vendors now looking to kind of build the same model, but kind of decouple that and build a more cloud agnostic way of building serverless and building function as service technology. So I'm pretty excited about this. I think this is this is still a little bit early in my opinion, but there are customers I know, I've spoken to many, that are already using and building applications in this vein. And I think long-term, this is going to be, a really nice abstraction layer for not every application, but for certain types of applications or certain parts of an application stack. It makes a lot of sense to build in this way.
So would Kubernetes exist if the cloud wasn't around?
That's a good question. I think so. I mean, Kubernetes is not. There's a lot of association to cloud, but Kubernetes by itself is not inherently something you have to, run in the cloud. People do it for convenience, and it's really easy, and it's obviously being pioneered by the likes of Google. But Kubernetes as a platform should be able to run anywhere. It's becoming, I mean, it's less and less, associated with the infrastructure itself, but more and more so attached to how are you building and managing and operating applications, right? So when you think about things like microservices architecture for applications, Kubernetes is a very it's a perfect fit. I mean, you wouldn't try to build microservices. You can, but you don't typically like to see microservices built in VMs because it's inherently a little bit more heavy, right, in terms of how you're architecting those, and the ability to scale in and out individual microservices within a broader application is very powerful, and that's exactly what Kubernetes brings. So don't think it's really tied to cloud per se, but it definitely is being fueled by the cloud today.
So this topic is actually fairly intriguing to me. So 5 secrets of Kubernetes: enabling containers, container orchestration that most enterprises and the cloud providers need for success. So what's your guess on what we should be talking about here? Because this is one of those topics that can go in 100 different directions. But what do you think are the core things that people should consider?
So if I read into this, if I think about enterprises, and I'm thinking not in so much for like the developers themselves. I think developers have a pretty firm grasp of how they can leverage Kubernetes if they're building containerized microservices, applications, and so forth. I think the biggest challenge that enterprises will face is figuring out how to productionize Kubernetes inside of their organization. So I think that a lot of the focus needs to be around probably more of the responsibilities of enterprise IT, and kind of focus around operations and management and so forth.
Well, that leads us to our next poll question. So how are you consuming and managing Kubernetes? CAAS, PAAS pass, such as OpenShift, containers as a service, platform as a service, managed service providers like GKE, EKS, and DIY, do it yourself, or others. So go ahead and chime in now. So, all right, John, let's do some betting. What do you think is going to win?
I think this is going to be a okay. I think it'll actually probably be heavily lopsided here, probably on the PaaS-CaaS side. I think OpenShift will probably resonate with a lot of folks. I'd be very interested to hear feedback on that, because OpenShift is a container platform, but it's not really open source Kubernetes. So Red Hat's done a great job. It's a great product, and it definitely lends itself to kind of the developer workflow, but it's not like some of the other Kubernetes offerings out there. So I am curious to see what the feedback is. I am also interested because I think a couple of weeks ago, was it last week or 2 weeks ago, there was a lot of noise around Google. They're making a big push around their managed service, right? So the ability to provide a managed Kubernetes service is something that I'd be curious to see if customers and maybe some of the audience is intrigued by or interested in, or maybe even using today. So
Yeah, I think my guess is it's going to be in order. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. So containers as a service, managed services, and then why. And actually, if you looked at this probably 2 years ago, 3 years ago, it was more DIY. People were doing an experiment, kind of just a proof of concept. So GigaOm's poll master, put up the results when you have a chance, and we'll go ahead and settle this once and for all.
Drum roll.
Yes.
Oh.
And, oh man. So managed services, GKE, EKS. I would not have said that was 1. I said that was 2, but not that by that big of a margin. And
I'd be really curious from the I'd be really curious from the audience that picked that, as far as like how they came to that conclusion. Was that a decision made by the business, kind of as their operating model of choice, or was there some other driver? I'd be curious if there's maybe, I don't know if they can give comments, but maybe they can put it into the question section as a comment. I'd love to see that later. So
yeah, and also we have a bit of a skew based on people who have interest in the topic that we have, and so they're going to be focused on one way or the other. But still, I think this surprises me. So let's go ahead and put the poll away, and we'll continue on.
I see your mouse, so you're still alive.
Okay, good. There we go. So we talk about the secrets. Number 1, we have deployment. We have the ability to get things out. So tell us a bit about what your thoughts are here, John.
So I think the interesting about deployment, I mean, obviously, given the webinar is focused more on the enterprise environment. I mean, I think what I've seen from customers, in their journey to something like Kubernetes, is that Kubernetes typically starts off is like a project with a specific team. So there's one team that's standing it up, an application team, and they kind of drive that, and that kind of effect starts to spread. And ultimately, what ends up happening is you have like a whole host of individual Kubernetes clusters all over the board. And then at some point, you reach an inflection point within an organization, and there's a management decision that says, okay, Kubernetes is popular within our company, so let's figure out how to turn this into a platform that our enterprise infrastructure and operations teams will manage. And so there's a decision that you have to make at that point, right? From a deployment perspective, you can continue to support deployments of individual clusters per team, per application team, or per tenant, if you will, or you can try to build one big Kubernetes cluster and try to build that as a standard platform for the entire business. And there's obviously pros and cons to that. The things I've heard is that, and actually, if you follow some of the security announcements around Kubernetes, is the unfortunate reality is that Kubernetes is not really a multi-tenant environment, right? It's not really meant to be truly multi-tenant like traditional infrastructure today, right? I mean, it might change in the future. So, Kubernetes, it doesn't guarantee some of the secure isolation that you would come to expect if you were building something like virtualization, for example. It does have, capabilities like you can use things like namespaces with some policies and so forth to kind of emulate and mimic that. But if you followed some of the security issues in the past, the problem is if you end up doing that wrong, it can wreak a lot of havoc, and it can be a pretty big, fault domain or security domain in which you're exposing yourself to. So I think the first decision that most customers need to figure out is what is their strategy around, providing effectively, multi-tenant environment. Do you want to take the approach of building, cluster, multi-tenancy within a single cluster, within a single Kubernetes deployment, or perhaps take another approach which is more focused around, isolating applications and tenants per cluster? And of course, when you do that, you have to keep in mind that there are some challenges. And again, like I said, pros and cons to both. If you're having to manage individual Kubernetes environments today, there's a lot of overhead associated with that, right? Being able to do all the monitoring and the operational management and the upgrading, all that stuff. There's work to be done there. So obviously, from our perspective, we'd love to be able to help take some of that burden off the shoulders of ops teams. But that's something that that teams and organizations need to consider when they're thinking about deployment strategies as a whole.
Absolutely. So monitoring. So one of the things that I think we've made huge advances on, I'd like you to chime in on this as well, John, is the fact of the matter is we have not only visibility into Kubernetes as a cluster manager and as a scheduler, but the ability to see deeper inside of applications we ever could before, the ability to kind of put API hooks, even on systems that are lifting and shifting and containerizing, so we can see and trace exactly what's going on and how these things in essence are kind of working behind the scenes. And so it used to be that if we had cluster managers, things such as Kubernetes, or similar patterns with the same features, we're kind of dependent on this kind of black box thing. So we could see the CPU cycles they were taking, the IO they were taking, things like that. And now we can see almost every aspect of the application. What are your thoughts on this?
No, I think it's so. I actually spent a lot of time in my career in the monitoring kind of ops space from my background, and obviously monitoring, it's critical, right? It's something that if you're going to be serious about putting something into production, it's a requirement. There's no questions about it. So I think most IT organizations today, I'll say most, they have a pretty good grasp on how to manage infrastructure monitoring, right? So being able to monitor, like you said, all the CPU utilization and IO and storage utilization and so forth, that's pretty good. But I think what's also required in a Kubernetes world is you also need the ability to aggregate all of the information, like the logs, the events, the metrics, et cetera, from not only the infrastructure, but you need to be able to correlate that with the platform itself, right? So Kubernetes in this case. So not only the infrastructure in which Kubernetes is running on, but also the Kubernetes environment itself. There's a lot of solutions right now, and this space is pretty hot right now. So if you look, even the cloud vendors, they're providing integrations and hooks. I was at a Google conference a couple of weeks ago. Their big push is around their management platform, their monitoring platform called Stackdriver, right? Has integrations both for their cloud services, but also on-prem. And I think if you look inside of Kubernetes, there's becoming more and more kind of de facto standardization around products and solutions like Prometheus, which is like a monitoring platform that you can use. You can actually run it inside of Kubernetes and also monitor Kubernetes itself, which is an interesting kind of inception model. And then there's also other kinds of technologies that they're helping visualizations and dashboards. But you're right. I mean, I think one of the interesting things is that when you abstract the platform itself and you're putting applications in there, you can actually get hooks in to see how applications are performing. And this is true even in the serverless space when you move up one level higher, which is being able to monitor and track and kind of see how applications are performing inside of Kubernetes is pretty powerful. So I mean, when you think about monitoring from a strategy perspective in the Kubernetes world, it has to encompass, in my opinion, kind of three things, right? Not only the infrastructure, which is bare bone minimum requirement, the Kubernetes platform itself, so like the runtime of the environment itself, and then thirdly, look for a solution that provides something into the application, into the container space too. And there's, again, kind of a multitude of solutions out there today.
So security, kind of opine on this as well. I mean, we're kind of moving from a centralized trust model to a distributed or federated trust model, with identity access management being the way that most people are approaching this. One of the things I think that was concerning when Kubernetes first came out, there weren't very many good security solutions that were directly native with the way in which we do things with Kubernetes and how we build and deploy applications. that seems to be changing, but the problem with the change is now we have so many different security solutions that we're using different patterns we're able to apply to Kubernetes. It's extremely confusing out there. So what's your advice?
Well, this is a very long topic that you could probably create an entire webinar on itself, because security is obviously multifaceted, right? So there's obviously security related to like the network security of Kubernetes itself, right? So if you don't take proper measures around, even securing the control plane, like the Kubernetes API itself, if that thing is compromised, all bets are off, right? There's no saving. Nothing you can do inside of Kubernetes and inside your containers that will save you from that, because it's like basically giving someone root access. It's like giving someone physical access to your hardware or to the hypervisor, right, in traditional infrastructure. So I think from our experience, obviously given our background working with enterprise infrastructure teams, and our view on security from an IT organization has to start from a network perspective. And again, from a strategy perspective, there are lots of ways that you can help kind of shore up security even around Kubernetes that should be taken into consideration, right? When you think about how this works in the public cloud, when you go look at Amazon or Google and the likes, how they provide security around Kubernetes actually starts first and foremost around the network perimeter itself. So the way they solve this is by providing network segmentation and kind of carve out and kind of separate Kubernetes into its own VPC, into its own virtual private cloud. And when you do that, you get the benefits. You don't have to reinvent the wheel here, right? You get the benefits of network security that's built into network isolation. And that's a huge first step that you have to consider. Then when you get into, so that's number one, right? When you get into then security around containers itself, what we've seen is that a lot of times, and if you follow the news about some of the vulnerabilities that have popped up recently in Kubernetes, in the Kubernetes world, it's really focused around things like not using the right RBAC, role-based access control measures, right? Or providing kind of bad security practices around exposing access and user tokens, security tokens, right? So if you don't kind of have good etiquette and good hygiene around those basic properties, then you're obviously at risk. So again, kind of roles and responsibilities, I would divide network responsibility into the IT team's hands. I think role-based access control is probably a split role between the SecOps, security operations, and the application teams. And so it's very important to remember, like I said earlier, because Kubernetes is not inherently multi-tenant through and through. If you don't take these measures and you have a compromised container inside a Kubernetes cluster, it can actually potentially compromise the entire cluster, right? And we've actually seen some of those cautions already in the news over the last few months, if you've been following. So.
Yeah, you think we're due for a big hack coming forward, and if you think it finally will be some of the newer tech out there, because I've noticed that the hacks have been coming from, in essence, exploiting vulnerabilities with more traditional technology. Now that we're moving to the cloud and security has been kind of weaponized as we're doing that, because it's kind of naturally the natural paranoia and making that happen. Do you think we're gonna find some event that's going to change people's mind and thinking about security and investing in security?
I think that if you follow the news, I think there was even recent, I don't remember how long ago it was, but even recently there was just, and by the way, just to be perfectly honest, this is not necessarily always a problem with Kubernetes itself. A lot of times it's operator error, right? So like, for example, if you don't take the right measures to secure the API and leave it open to the internet, it's kind of a problem, right? And I think we saw that with some companies in recent months. So it's not just, you can do all you want, but this kind of reminds me of the problem with Amazon with S3, and people started publishing all this data into S3, but then not realizing that it was public by default, right? And that everybody could read it. It's kind of like that. It's both a mix of strategy in terms of planning, but also you gotta understand how to actually operate the thing in order to be secure. So
you're saying our biggest security vulnerability is stupidity?
Sometimes, right? Sometimes.
So let's talk a bit about upgrading here and the ability to, in essence, manage the movement into new applications, new databases, new platforms, and the ability to do so smoothly. One of the things that I'm finding is that even in DevOps environments where things are pretty well automated in terms of stability testing, compatibility testing, things like that, major upgrades, if they are using version numbers like moving from 3.9 to 4.0, are typically going to be met with an enormous amount of bugs. And if you look at, even downloading things for our phones, this seems to be a time when we're going to run into most of the issues, the fact people even expect it. Yeah. So what's your advice here?
So I think Kubernetes itself is actually fairly good when it comes to upgrading. If you've ever done an upgrade of Kubernetes, it's dramatically better than upgrading like a traditional infrastructure solution. I think the challenge that comes oftentimes with upgrading, there's two kind of different thoughts that I have, right? Number one is obviously if you're trying to manage multiple Kubernetes clusters because you're a large organization, you have many application teams, then just, again, the overhead of having to manage all of them can be pretty overwhelming, right? So you'd ideally want to have some sort of platform that can automate all of that. That would be ideal. But oftentimes the challenge also stems from the fact that applications or the containers that you actually put into Kubernetes may not lend itself to how Kubernetes actually upgrades itself. So namely, I'm thinking about things like persistent applications that have state, for example, and being able to manage those in a very clean way. Thinking about things like databases inside of containers and different kinds of data platforms and so forth, and being able to manage that effectively sometimes can be challenging. So I don't think there's a silver bullet for this today, unfortunately. I think there's a lot of innovation happening and best practices. I think the most important thing here is don't put a strategy in place that's going to take upgrades in a manual way. Kubernetes is very prime to do this in an automated fashion, which means that you can build in testing beforehand and roll this out in a programmatic and a systematic way. So you kind of eliminate or reduce some of the error-prone activities and tasks that oftentimes humans introduce, right? So I mean, I don't have a great answer, but if other people have other thoughts on this, I think there would be be greatly interested in hearing how they're tackling this problem as well.
I think that's a good answer, and I agree with it. So let's move on to scaling. What's your advice here?
So, I mean, again, like I mentioned at the very beginning, I think scaling, obviously, this picture, I think is pretty obvious. When you talk about scaling, the two ideas that come to mind are kind of scaling up, so increasing your capacity of existing nodes, existing instances and so forth, or scaling horizontally. Now, Kubernetes is pretty, it's built to scale horizontally. I mean, this is how Google's been powering their massive websites at YouTube and so forth, right, on top of containers. So scaling horizontally is kind of a built-in architectural design of Kubernetes itself. So scaling that out is actually pretty easy, right? Scaling master nodes, master replicas, worker nodes, adding those in, it's actually pretty easy to scale. So I think a lot of the focus around scaling needs to be around how do you automate this? Now, if you think about scaling in the public cloud, it's pretty slick, right? Because they own the infrastructure, obviously, which makes it easy, and they have a lot of capacity, which is also a perk that you may not have on-prem or in your private data centers. But I think more interesting in the public cloud is the fact that they've been able to tap into things like auto-scaling groups. So if you think about kind of going to a model where you're trying to, do as little operationally as possible and have the cluster self-manage and be able to kind of handle the capacity and the load dynamically, then you combine that with something like auto-scaling groups, which is kind of basically it's a demand-based scaling policy. When you see load, it can automatically bring up additional worker nodes, for example, right? That's pretty slick. So if you have that same kind of operational model in the enterprise, being able to leverage that, sometimes it can be challenging, right? If you have that same requirement. So I look for solutions that can kind of take some of those cloud paradigms, obviously without the elastic infrastructure behind it, but take some of those same paradigms for Kubernetes itself and then apply that into the enterprise IT environment as well.
Let's talk about must-know keys to enabling successful technology. And so this is probably Stratoscale's neck of the woods. So what are your key advice points here?
Well, so I think if you think about some of the areas that we just talked about, all of those areas historically had been something like you mentioned earlier. If you go back a couple of years ago, were kind of DIY, do it yourself inside of the enterprise organization. Is very intriguing to see again that more and more people are relying on a managed service. So what we're focused on at Stratoscale is really around bringing that managed service experience, but bring that capability in the form of a software solution that enterprise IT can own and deploy. So in other words, imagine turning enterprise IT into your own internal service provider that can provide you that same kind of public cloud experience, but out of the comfort and security of your own data center. So things from, again, from deployment to monitoring to security, upgrades to scaling. These are all capabilities that we've honed a lot of our time in building into our platform that allows enterprise IT to deliver their own internal Kubernetes as a service for their lines of businesses and for their application teams. So, as I think if there's audience members that are looking to take their Kubernetes to the next level and kind of productionizing it and operationalizing it, obviously we'd love to talk to them, see if we can help them make that a little bit of an easier journey.
So last question, what do you think before we get into the Q&A, what do you think are the two newest things in the last few years around Kubernetes that you guys have kind of seen in the marketplace and adopted?
So there's a huge focus around, I mean, if you remember where Kubernetes first started, it was really primarily based for stateless applications. So, web front ends and the like cache servers, et cetera. So there was never really a need back then to have persistent storage of any sort attached to containers. That seems to have changed dramatically in the last 12 months. Everyone now is talking about integration with their storage arrays, right? With the likes of Pure and NetApp and EMC and so forth, because customers and developers are starting to think, well, why can't I put a database in here and attach it with persistent storage, right? And so there's a lot of work being done in that, both at our company as well as in the industry. There's some standardization that's happened, which is great. There's still a lot of work to do, but we're also working with the storage vendors to provide kind of seamless integration into the storage solution. So if you're an enterprise that's using Pure Storage, for example, today, and you want to be able to dynamically and automatically leverage that to provide persistent containers, right? Persistent storage for containers. We want to make that as seamless and easy as possible. So I think there's a lot more advancement happening there, and you can say the same thing from another angle, which is also on the networking side. So I think overall, deeper and deeper integration into the infrastructure teams and to the infrastructure stacks is going to be a continued trend that we see.
Let's get into questions, John. So, one of the questions we got from the audience is, how is container orchestration leveraged from DevOps? And I'd be interested to know that yourself, your perspective on it.
Ooh, okay. So, again, I think DevOps, their goal is in trying to automate everything, ideally, right, to be able to provide faster response times and also a more consistent experience and consistent service, right? So I think Kubernetes is obviously at the forefront of many of those conversations. I mean, Red Hat with OpenShift is doing a great job because they're being very prescriptive and saying this is how you would implement a DevOps workflow. Now, from what I've heard from some customers is that that's obviously a good starting point, but what we're probably going to end up seeing, this is my own opinion, is that as the Kubernetes ecosystem kind of evolves and kind of advances and matures, the DevOps community is going to latch on more and more to different tool sets, right? And all those tools are going to be compatible with Kubernetes out of the box. I mean, it's pretty fascinating because you now look, every single major software vendor offers some form of a container that you can just download and include into your pipeline, into your DevOps workflows that allow you to completely automate the deployment of very, very complex applications, right? So I think it represents a unique approach to being able to automate end-to-end the application delivery for many, many organizations.
So the final question, we're running out of time. So who controls, and I love this question, by the way, and I'm going to provide my take on this after you do, John. Who controls the Kubernetes architecture, the developer or the architect?
Oh man, that is a tough one. I'm actually literally working with some customers hashing through this right now. Our conversations are with the infrastructure team, so I'll be biased and say the the infrastructure teams. And the only reason I would say that is because again we're biased and working on with enterprise kind of on-prem Kubernetes deployments. In the cloud, I don't know as much, so I'd love to get your take on that.
Yeah, I think it's the ultimately it has to be a collaboration between the two. I don't think we're in a point right now where we have a heavily structured development and architecture organization where people, play one role. I think that the architects need to understand and leverage the knowledge of the developers and vice versa. So the cloud architects typically have the knowledge of the how the thing participates with the larger meta architecture within the enterprise, traditional systems, all the other hundreds of other cloud systems it's dealing with, and be able to exchange data and live successfully and be able to monitor and manage those things. But nobody knows those systems and the core architecture of those systems like the developer. And I think the architect really, when people try to imply and impose, formal methodologies and rigorous and flexible architectures onto the Kubernetes developers, they're typically not successful. And I think that's but the counter to that is that they do need some discipline to figure out how it exists and plays well with the other systems within the enterprise, cloud or not. So
Right.
it needs to be a collaboration.
Totally agree. Totally agree.
Well, let's go ahead and end it there. I want to thank you all for attending this webinar and learn a lot about Kubernetes. I learned a lot about Kubernetes and where things are moving and what are the best practices and things you can do to ensure your success. I'd like to thank John and our sponsor, Stratoscale, for bringing this to us and bringing this knowledge to you. And so I hope you guys enjoyed it and had a great time. And until then, best of luck in building your Kubernetes architectures. And I'll see you next time on this GigaOm webinar.